Nicholas is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and a former literary editor of the London Daily Telegraph. His books have been translated into over 20 languages, and the Wall Street Journal have described him as one of the best English novelists of our time. But be it in fiction or non-fiction, Nicholas has an alchemist's gift of transforming history's forgotten fragments and oddments into pure narrative gold. His diverse novels include The Vision of Elena Silvers, The Dancer Upstairs, which was made into a film by John Malkovich starring Javier Bardem, Snowleg, Secrets of the Sea, and Inheritance. And his non-fiction includes his famous biography of Bruce Chatwin, as well as his extraordinary 2014 biography, his Aunt Priscilla, who spent the war years in Nazi-occupied France and in Tasmania. What they all share is a unique capacity to illuminate the corners of history, sometimes the very darkest corners, in magical ways. Now, in a brand new novella, Oddfellows, he's taken a 100-year-old fragment of Australian history and transformed it into a tale that speaks powerfully to the current moment. Please welcome Nicholas Shakespeare. Nicholas, you've fostered for kernels or nuggets of stories from Europe to Latin America, Armenia to Australia. Yet you wrote recently in The Monthly that history in Australia lies close to the surface, but its nuggets are hard to see. So tell us about this little nugget of history that led to this book and why you didn't overlook it.
Well, I owe it really to your wonderful writer, Murray Bale, who is a novelist I greatly admire, who has often come to stay with us in Tasmania. And it was he who led me to Patrick White, who I revere above all of your great novelists. And it was he who told me about 2 years ago of a story that he had discovered through a painting. He sent me an email showing a portrait, a primitive painting by Sam Byrne, who'd lived in Broken Hill, with a mouth-watering title. It showed two men lying on their stomachs with turbans, firing at a train full of happy, it was kind of open train full of happy people. And the title was Turks Fire on Picnic Train, January the 1st, 1915. And he said, this looks like a story that you might be interested in, with your love of writing about non-English people and non-English places. And so 2 years ago, we went to Broken Hill together to dig up what we could find about this story. Now, I'd been to Broken Hill on my first visit to Australia in 1994, and I'd gone to Pro Hart's gallery, and I'd seen this painting by Titian that he claimed to own, and I was very taken with this landscape. It reminded me of Patagonia, where I had spent part of my youth. And Darwin has a wonderful expression about Patagonia, these endless landscapes, that this limitless horizon forces the mind in on itself. And I felt very much in Broken Hill that same pressure of both expansion and contraction, and of very warm-hearted people there who had lots of stories that were unmined. And we went out, we dug around, we found a little truck which marked the spot where these two Turks apparently had attacked this picnic train. We went to Silverton, and what was kind of strange is that although the story had been very well known at the time, and it was billed as the first and only act of hostility on Australian soil in the entire First World War, and newspaper reports at the time had been full of interviews with survivors, it had been forgotten since then, slightly like the Armenian massacres, which in a novel I wrote called Inheritance. You know, it was known at the time, and then the Armenians had been forgotten. And similarly, the story of this very dramatic incident where two camel men, not Turks at all, but Indians, from the northwest frontier, British passport holders, had, in response to the Sultan of Turkey in 1914, who the Turks were the allies of the Germans, and so the Germans had pushed the Sultan to have a jihad against Britain and her allies, so in the hope that Muslims in the British Empire would rise up against the enemies of the Turks and the Germans. Well, this edict, this call to jihad was announced in November 1914, and it had a kind of, it was not regarded anywhere. I think a captain in Mesopotamia had his throat slit, some Russians in the Caucasus went over to the other side. There was a mutiny in Singapore with an Indian Army regiment, which resulted in about 47 being killed. And the only other place where this call to jihad seems to have had a response was at the far end of the earth in the mining town of Broken Hill. And what happens on that day, the 1st of January 1915, is that this picnic train of 1,200 men, women, and children, all in kind of white muslin dresses and sun hats and parasols and picnic hampers, they're all going out to a 14-mile journey to Silverton to have a picnic. And they will have running races there, and they will sling swings over branches, and they will walk along the riverbank. And they're steaming out of Broken Hill, and suddenly they see beside the track an ice cream cart, which they recognize. It belongs to one of these Indians. And they see a red flag, and they begin to. The fireman thinks it may be somebody shooting ammunition on a excess ammunition or something. So shots ring out. Some people think it's boys shooting rabbits. Some people think it's a guard of honor for the passing train. They suddenly see these two men with white turbans. And 2 or 3 people start to collapse, blood pouring down their white dresses. And suddenly they realize that this is an attack. And 4 people are shot dead, 7 are injured. This enraged group of picnickers get off the train and chase these 2 men who go back towards Broken Hill. And they set up a kind of last post around some white rocks, quartz rocks. They fly their homemade Turkish flag, and about 2 hours later they are killed, and that is the Battle of Broken Hill. But no one knows where their bodies are buried, and it's as if the story itself, after a few years, had vanished. I mean, it hadn't vanished. There were 2 novels I didn't realize at the time had been written about it, which came out in the last 10 years, but somehow the story failed to purchase on the imagination.
So what made you want to write it? I mean, as you say, we don't even know where these guys are buried. People had forgotten about it. So what was it that kept you?
Well, the initial drama is extraordinary, and writers are very superstitious creatures. And I remember that I had just finished 4 years on a book about my aunt in occupied France, called Priscilla. And we were staying at the hotel in Broken Hill, the Palace Hotel, where Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, had been filmed. And then I discovered one of the people who was shot dead was a 17-year-old, very attractive, dark-haired girl who was with her boyfriend, Clarence O'Brien. And I discovered when I went to the archives and found a picture of her that her middle name was Priscilla. And so somehow, I mean, writers are ludicrously clinging to some clue that you're on the right path. And so, because you're about to commit yourself to 2 or 3 years, possibly, to a book. So I felt, yes, there's something about this that I do want to invest in. And I went walking with Murray through the streets. We went to the archive, we went to the museum. I mean, not many people, 1 or 2 people remembered the story, but it wasn't a kind of big deal. And one could immediately picture this 17-year-old girl with the boyfriend who is a minor. And I had this image of her desperately worried that he was going to propose to her at the end of the picnic, and not really wanting to have her horizons limited to this 14-mile universe, really. The Mullock in Broken Hill, and then the Silverton, the creek bed. And so I was thinking, what happens if she'd already met one of these Indian, the camel driver or the ice cream seller, and he had opened up her horizons a bit to the world beyond Broken Hill. Not a love affair, but a kind of fledgling love affair, a relationship, offering her an expanse of her horizons. So I started to toy with this, and I got back to England, and in the Bodleian in Oxford, I spent many months reading up histories of Broken Hill and looking at contemporary newspaper accounts in order to get under to marinate myself in the texture of the town at the time in 1914. And bit by bit, the characters came to life. I mean, I find writing fiction slightly like blowing up a lilo. It's exhausting, but nothing happens until right at the end, when suddenly the lilo firms up. But it reminds you that no breath is wasted. And so suddenly, I didn't need to go on researching because the characters started to totter into life.
I think, as somebody said on a panel this morning, that the romance, or the romance that couldn't be between the young Pashtun and the girl, was just heartbreakingly sad. The whole thing, I mean, the ice cream cart, it would be comic if it wasn't so tragic. It was deeply, deeply sad. Now, these people, they lived on the outskirts of Broken Hill and they'd been there for 20 years or something.
Well, while I was researching it and writing it, clearly in the atmosphere, a parallel story was going on. ISIS was unfolding. I mean, in fact, when we got back to the hotel one night, we were told that there'd been an attack on the Boston Marathon. Two Chechen brothers had opened fire or thrown homemade bombs into this crowd, a bit like the picnickers in a sense. I mean, innocents were being attacked for what seemed to be the same reasons of feeling ostracized, feeling misunderstood, racist kind of elements. And then as the year unfolded, I would watch in China, Muslim tribes would attack people on railway stations, minority tribes under threat. And then in England, I remember in Woolwich seeing these two Nigerian Muslims attack the drummer Lee Rigby. So what had happened in Broken Hill suddenly seemed to be repeating itself around the world. So almost as if the two unburied bodies of the Indians, they're called Gul Mehmed and Mullah Abdullah, in a sense their restless souls were still inhabiting and stalking the earth in a contemporary way. And this is before what happened in Sydney at the Café Siege and Charlie Hebdo in Paris. And I don't know, it suddenly seemed that this wasn't a story that was 100 years old in the middle of nowhere. It seemed to connect like a kind of arrow right into the center of what's happening at the moment. And I think that's one of the exciting things about fiction. I mean, you don't know why you're attracted to a story often, and then only afterwards is the reason become manifest.
And, you say that a lot of these Afghans and Pashtuns had married local women, but they were treated abysmally.
Well, part of my research discovered that, you had... The Afghans came over in the 1860s and formed mainly the main Muslim community in Australia, and they came over to help open up the interior. So the camel trains were able to bring ballot boxes, they brought provisions to lonely outposts, they took the telegraph poles and wires there, and they kind of replaced the teamsters. I mean, it was cheaper to have a camel. A camel man cost £3 a month. Somebody with a teamster of bullocks cost £45 a month, and they were much quicker, and a camel could cross 100 miles a day. So suddenly you had great prejudice against these people who were opening up, these kind of aliens. And in fact, you had in the West Australian Parliament, somebody called Probyn Smith, I think, warned the West Australian Parliament in the 1890s against this camel invasion, this Afghan invasion. They were called turkey lollies, and said that, when there is a call to jihad, you can't trust them because they fought the British in the Second Afghan War. So for 20 years, there was quite a mounting prejudice against this community in Broken Hill. And what seems to have happened is that, on the outbreak of war, they become further ostracized as representing, the Muslim enemy. And I think it just became too much for them. The butcher, the older man was about 60 as far as we can tell. I mean, one of the problems in researching it is that we only have the white fella's stories. So we don't really know too much about them, but what one can ascertain is that they'd probably been in Broken Hill 20 years. They both came from the northwest frontier, and one of them was, the older one is about 60, and he'd been the butcher in the camel camp and had been slaughtering the meat according to halal practices. And Broken Hill is a very union, almost the most union town in Australia. And you had this wonderful, for fictional purposes, enemy, the acting sanitary inspector, a man called Cornelius Brosnan, who was determined not to, to make sure that the Afghans slaughtered their meat at the municipal abattoir next to pigs, which was against the tenets of the Muslim faith. And so whenever he found up at the camel camp that they'd been slaughtering the sheep kind of not at the abattoir, he would find this Mullah Abdullah, who had no money to pay. And so what happened in the second instance, he fined him again, and suddenly he was fined £3, and he didn't have the money to pay for it. And it looked as if that he was going to be arrested on the very day that they decided to launch this attack, this kind of this two-man jihad, two men declaring war on Australia. What I found attractive and exciting also is that many of the men who weren't on the train, the kind of brothers and fathers and sons of the picnickers, were at that moment about to land in Turkey. I mean, a few more weeks they were going to be landing in Gallipoli, and many of them from Broken Hill would be shot by the ore they themselves had dug up, which had been sent to Freiburg. Most of Broken Hill's metals were shipped to Freiburg, which was known as the Mecca of ores, and turned into bullets for German guns. So again, you had this extraordinary connection between somewhere that seemed remote, but actually was very united with the other side of the earth.
And did this never become an issue at the time, the selling of ores to Germany?
Well, as soon as the war was declared, Broken Hill, all the contracts were cancelled. And that's why some of the miners were laid off. That's why many of them joined the Commonwealth Expeditionary Forces. And that's why also there was more racism and tension against what was known as Ghan Town, this camp of probably only about 30 Afghan cameleers and their families. As you say, many of whom were married to white Australians and had 5 or 6 children in the families.
And they were teased by children, and I think the older one had his little humpy burnt down.
He had a limp, and the kids would chase him and throw stones at him, and he would complain to the police, who never took any action. No, I mean, I suspect if you scratch beneath the Chechens' surface in Boston and you scratch beneath the Muslim Nigerians in London, you're seeing many of the same patterns.
Yes, so it's not so much the call to jihad, it's the underlying wounds.
The call to jihad legitimizes your grievances and connects you with a bigger worldview that you have. But it's surprising that there wasn't a bigger call to jihad. I mean, it's so weird that it took place in the middle of the desert, this isolated incident. And I think very few Australians, I don't know how many people in this audience had heard of. Can I ask anyone to raise their hand who'd heard of it? So that's 5 people. As I say, it was known, but not popularly known. So I don't make any claims to have discovered the story. I've kind of discovered it for myself, but I was rather pleased to discover it for a number of other people here.
And you say that it would be a mistake to disregard the lessons of this tale, don't you? That the bones of it keep reassembling, as it were.
Well, only in that the more I look around, the more it seems to be happening everywhere. I mean, I think there was even an ISIS leader who's Australian, who was announced in September as somebody who's in charge of some great swathe of what was Syria or Iraq.
I think there's quite a few, actually. But we don't know their stories, I suppose. It's an enduring question for our time, isn't it? But Nicholas, it strikes me that one of the most striking characteristics of much of your fiction is this prescience, if you like. This happened when you wrote The Dancer Upstairs, and that has some uncanny parallels with this story. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this is a novel. I'm the son of a diplomat, so I grew up in many countries in the Far East and in South America. And I was living in Lima at the time when the Shining Path became quite active. And this was a group of extreme Marxist freedom fighters who wanted to bring in a form of Marxism that they thought that Fidel Castro was a chorus girl in terms of his Marxism. So they wanted a really extreme form. And it was kind of rather terrifying living in Lima because they would issue no manifestos. So just like they were precursors of Al-Qaeda, and it's thought from several sources that many Al-Qaeda people were actually living in Lima during the time and learnt some of the lessons from the Sendero Luminoso. So you would have, for instance, masked people would come into a village and they would take the government representative, the mayor or a vicar, and they would slit their throats and they would use the blood against the wall, and they'd always have one name. It was Viva El Presidente Gonzalo. This Gonzalo, no one knew who he was. And they gave no interviews, they issued no manifestos, they had no text that you could quarrel with. And it was all in the countryside, and it was coming closer and closer towards the capital, Lima. And people were terrified. It wasn't really reported. Journalists who went out to try and find out about it were killed. I think they killed about 48 journalists by the late 80s. And I became kind of completely fascinated by who was this Gonzalo. And very naively, I went off in search of him. And I discovered he was a Kantian philosopher who had gone into hiding, and we didn't know if he was alive or dead. He was thought to possibly be in London shopping at Harrods, or he was in Albania. And so I pieced together, I found the man who'd been present at his birth, I found some of his students. I went as far as I could in trying to, like a papier-mâché model, piece together this person. And it only got so far. He seems a man without much personality. I found that he had not liked the music of Porgy and Bess, and he had drunk mineral water on his honeymoon. And I couldn't kind of do much with this. So I invented, I thought, the idea that he had psoriasis. I thought that, I'd read somewhere that Lenin, one of those revolutionists, had psoriasis. So I thought maybe the reason he's not in public is that it's about vanity. He's kind of hiding his face. So I gave him psoriasis, and I then gave him, I thought, if you're the fourth sword of world revolution, you'd probably have a weakness. You'd smoke American cigarettes, so that's a fairly obvious thing. So I gave him, he smoked Camel, I think, in my novel. And he would have a weakness for someone like Frank Sinatra. So I had him in hotel rooms kind of humming Frank Sinatra tunes. Anyway, this was the first novel called The Vision of Elena Silves, and it came out. He was still at large, and the revolution was creeping closer and closer to Lima. And then in a safe house near where we lived in Lima, he clearly had just been there, and they found a cassette, and he's dancing with two women to Zorba the Greek. And then finally in September, I think it was September 1992, he's discovered above a ballet studio in downtown Lima. There was a rather beautiful ballerina, middle class, who taught middle-class kids downstairs, and upstairs, a curtained window, which was thought to be rented out. And the policeman who found him was a philosopher like him, and he had met a man I knew in England, General Clutterbuck, who'd been a kind of terrorist expert. And Clutterbuck had said, don't spend money on helicopters and tanks. Just be like a novelist. There's no information that's too small. Track them, follow them, color of dress, color of wallpaper, movement. Be like Sherlock Holmes. Build up a dossier, and suddenly you'll break through. So this policeman decided to do just that. So they tracked and they watched, and they found that the ballet studio, for some reason, that the ballerina was a cousin of a nun who was involved with the Shining Path. So they cased the ballet studio, and they found that she was bringing out rather large rubbish bags for somebody who was just meant to be on her own living downstairs. And so they went through the rubbish bags, and they found a medicine called Kennicort E, which is for the treatment of psoriasis. And they realized that somebody's upstairs.
You had written the dancer upstairs?
I'd written the Vision of Elena Silvestre, which has him dancing Frank Sinatra to psoriasis. Anyway, they go in and they capture the full sword of the World Revolution watching the boxing match on television with psoriasis. And this seemed so exciting to me when I heard about this in London. It seemed, again, a validation of the fictional process, that if you absorb the available facts, you might get close to what actually happens. So you call it prescience, I call it just a bit of hard work and luck. So I went out to Lima and I interviewed the ballerinas because she was now in prison. I interviewed her ex-husband, her lovers. I interviewed the policeman who'd captured. I said, I've been following him as long as you have. And I gave him a copy of my first book. He said, oh, it's in there. He loves, so he had psoriasis and he loves Frank Sinatra. He said, well, it's extraordinary you say about Frank Sinatra because we've been trying to get him to talk, and he only started talking when we gave him the greatest hits of Frank Sinatra, because apparently he would sing My Way. So I thought he only liked Zorba the Greek, but apparently he did like Frank Sinatra.
Extraordinary.
And I went back actually to Lima about 3 years ago to interview the ballerina in prison. And it was a very moving experience because a film was made of her, and she had seen the film, and she wanted to tell me where I'd got things wrong in the novel, and I wanted to hear where I things got wrong in the novel. And she wanted, I think, to use me to tell the policeman who had captured her that she was innocent, that she never knew that upstairs was Abimah Guzman. So that night I saw the policeman, and I said, she thanks you, she knows you saved her life, but she just wanted to tell you that she never knew that it was Abigail Guzman. He said, no. But he remembered that when he wanted to check out if she did know him, and she said that I had Guzman there, and I summoned her up to come into my office. And as she came into the door, she saw him, and she said, President, and ran forward and embraced him. So she said she had known all the time.
Oh, wow. How extraordinary, Nicholas. That is just amazing. And you're also, one of the recurring themes in all your fiction too is the notion of the banality of evil. Often it seems you come across these little nuggets or fragments of history, and they combine with this deep preoccupation with the banality of evil. And you're able to illuminate it in a very unique way. I'm thinking, for instance, of Snowleg, with the little small smell jars in the Stasi Museum. Tell us about that.
This was a novel set in East Germany. And I'd never been interested in Germany. I think English people of my generation, it was a colourless place on the map. We hurried over it to get to the Mediterranean, and we used to read trash mags, we call them, under the blankets at school, which were all repeating the Second World War with Sergeant Maggot Malone against the horrible, horrendous Boche. And I remember that when my Peruvian novel came out in Germany, I was invited by the German publishers to come. And so I went to Germany the first time, and I met some wonderful Germans, and I then began to be curious about Germany. I was curious about why East Germany had vanished, that as soon as the borders came down, there was no curiosity, it seemed to me, on behalf of West Germans about their East German cousins. So I had a kind of romantic idea that they'd love to meet their aunts and uncles and grandparents, and this was far from the truth. They didn't want to go near them. And they hadn't really even ventured into East Germany. And I'd had a kind of bad love affair that had gone wrong, and so I was kind of trying to mend a heart. And my German publisher lent me his flat in Hamburg to kind of begin work on a biography of Bruce Chatwin I was engaged in. And I remember he came one night to see me, to see how I was, and I was in a pretty big mess. And somehow we got talking, and out came a question about, I asked him what the worst thing he'd ever done was. And he could see that I was quite flayed, and immediately answered in a way that he'd never talked about this story before. And this was the story he told, that when he was a student in West Germany, he had, this is in the 80s when the Iron Curtain's still up, he had been invited to Poland as part of a group of actors, a mime group of 3 mime artists who were going to perform in Warsaw at a theatre there. And the stage manager, another student, had to cancel. And so the stage manager asked my friend Nico if he would go as stage manager. And Nico said, I didn't know about theatre, I hate theatre. He said, no, all you have to do is dim down the lights and bring on some kind of props. Otherwise, it's a very rare privilege to get into Poland. So he said, okay, I'll go. So all you have to do is take a suit and a tie, because on the last night, you're going to be invited to the smart hotel in Warsaw by the German ambassador, and you have to go to that. So great. So they have 3 nights, and this mime show, packed audiences, and on the 3rd night, he goes to the Crush Bar, and there are these really attractive Polish girls, all wanting to talk to their equivalents from the West and talk about theatre and novels. So he's talking to this gorgeous girl, he says, and he's just so excited. The adrenaline of this successful mime show is gone to his head. And suddenly he's tapped on the shoulder saying, we've got to go off to this hotel now. And so this girl is talking, has got another girl friend with her, and the girl says, well, can we come too? And Nico says, yes, I'm sure that's fine. So they all get in a taxi, and as they arrive at the hotel, he sees the doorman watching them advance down this carpet. And the doorman looks at the girls and says, sorry, sir, they're not invited. So he kind of shrugs, and the girls start talking to the doorman, arguing with him. And meanwhile, through the door, the revolving door, the other 3 members of the cast are waiting for him to, come on, you're late. So he goes through, shrugging. He goes down a corridor into a room where suddenly everyone's seated. It's a really smart dinner party, this. And there's the German ambassador and his wife, and there are some chambers of commerce people, and they're under these bright chandeliers, and he sits down next to the German ambassadors, who starts talking to him. Oh, God, that was wonderful. Do you want to be an actor when you leave university? That kind of stuff. So he has a drink, and he relaxes. And then suddenly, he hears behind him a scuffle, and the whole table looks up, and he turns around, and there is the doorman with the girl that he had talked to. And she looks around the room and points to him. So the doorman, one step at a time, brings her towards the table. And he's standing in front of him. And the doorman says, sorry, sir, but this girl says you know her. This girl says that it was okay for her to come tonight. Do you know her? And Nico said that in that moment, he saw her face under these chandeliers, and he could see that everybody in the room, what they were thinking, that this is a girl from the Warsaw streets. And he said no. And the doorman said, thank you, sir. He never forgets the girl's eyes looking at him in astonishment. And the doorman takes her away, and then conversation resumes. And he said that's the worst thing he'd ever done, and he'd thought of her ever since. And I just thought, I want to write that story. I want an Englishman to do that and to go back and look for that girl years later and to ask her forgiveness. So that was the beginning of Snowleg.
And a whole cluster of other things collided too, didn't they? In Inheritance, I mean, you used Lang Hancock's discovery of iron ore, the Armenian massacre, to name just a couple, with Portuguese Fado, Musings of Montaigne, and a very terrible Australian con man.
Well, I feel a veteran of the Perth Writers' Festival because I was at the first one, and it was a wonderful occasion, as this one is. And I remember meeting several poets and novelists who've become friends since. I mean, that's one of the things about these festivals. It's wonderful to speak to you, but it's also wonderful for us to meet fellow Australian writers and writers from all over the world, and we get to read their novels and their recommendations and become friends in many cases. And I think it was while I was in Perth in 2001 that I heard this extraordinary story about Lang Hancock flying one night in the late 1950s, which you all know about, but I mean, I'd never heard this story, of being lowered by a thunderstorm between these mountains and seeing glistening rust on either side of him and deciding to mark the coordinates and then peg it out for himself, and this is the biggest kind of iron ore deposit on Earth. And I thought that is such an this can only happen in a place like Australia. I mean, in England, every blade of grass is monitored and counted. I mean, it's unthinkable that your life could change overnight by seeing a piece of kind of barren real estate. And so I squirreled that away. And what happened in that novel, again, I have to thank Murray Bale. He'd come to stay with us in Tasmania, and he'd been researching his own novel and had come across in Sydney, a lawyer's office, a story which seemed so original. He'd found a man, a solicitor, who said that, oh God, we had a client years ago who they went to a funeral and they discovered they were the only person at the funeral, and they discovered they were at the wrong funeral. And they went ahead and, it was 5 minutes before the end. They were too embarrassed to kind of leave, and there were only two other people there. And they thought, well, this chap plainly needs all the mourners he can get. So I'll wait till the end of the funeral. So he waits to the end of the funeral, and then he's about to leave when he's asked to sign his name in the visitor's book, and then his address, and he does that. And then 3 days later, he gets a letter from a firm solicitor saying, according to the terms of the deceased, the estate is to be divided up amongst those who attended his funeral. And I thought this was I don't really like legal novels at all, but this seemed to be a corker of a story. And I could map it out instantly, in a sense. You either make it a kind of Goodfellas thing where he inherits a chain of brothels, or you actually have him inherit a lot of money. So I had him inherit £17 million, and he was a kind of poor publisher. His life's gone wrong, his girlfriend's left him, his job's in a mess, and this is all set in London in a rainy February, the worst month in London. And suddenly he gets £17 million, legitimately. I mean, legally he has inherited the stuff. I thought I'd write this in 3 weeks, and I had film rights, pouring out of my ears. And so I wrote the first sequence, which I've told you about, very quickly. And then I realized, no, you have to earn this story, because actually the story isn't about that. It's about who on earth left him this money. Why did that man make these conditions? And that's when the story of Lang Hancock came back into my mind. And so I kind of adapted that as the person who might have been a kind of Lang Hancock figure. He was an Armenian in my novel, who had made masses of money and then gone to England and become anonymous.
Because you were quite steamed up at this point about the Armenian massacre.
Well, I wasn't steamed up. I became steamed up because my wife had known Orhan Pamuk, and she had told me that Orhan Pamuk had actually created great problems for himself when he even dared to talk about the Armenian massacres. And had been threatened with imprisonment and everything. And I thought, gosh, we know about this, but why don't we ever get enraged about it? And Turkey was trying to join the European community, and yet it was denying the fact that a massacre had taken place. So, this is the way fiction writers work. We're completely carnivorous scavengers once we're on the course of a story. And so I think we suck to ourselves whatever bits of fascinated material we've put in our backpacks.
You've described how you spent a year in the Bodleian giving life to Oddfellows. Chatwin biography took 7 years of your life. Snowleg consumed 5. The Dancer Upstairs, you say, obsessed you for 10 years. And not to mention Priscilla. Tell us about that, because that That's a masterpiece of both research and storytelling.
This is a memoir or a history about my aunt, an English aunt I had called Priscilla, who was my mother's sister. And she had been very beautiful, and I used to go and stay with her as a child. She was married for her second marriage to a mushroom farmer in Wittering, who was a really tyrannical man. And she seemed rather lonely and was always in her room upstairs. And I was very curious about this sadness. She had an aura of sadness. I remember her perfume. I used to sit on her bed in her bedroom and watch the first television set I ever saw and watch the first films I ever saw with her. And she used to stay with us in Rio or Paris, where we lived. And when she died in 1982, I kept pestering my parents about her previous marriage. She'd been married to a French viscount, and she had been apparently arrested by the Germans and tortured and put in a concentration camp, and she never talked about this. And so the legend grew up that she had been in the resistance, a legend she never bothered to deny. And so I think about 6-7 years ago, I decided I must find out what she did in the resistance, my brave aunt, who was tortured by the Germans. And I rang her stepdaughter and I said, did Priscilla leave any documents behind? She said, yes, under the television set you used to watch, there was a box, and when she died, I found in this box amazing collection of photographs and love letters, and you're welcome to look at them. And her attempt to write her own novel. I said, my goodness, so there'll be some documentary evidence. So I went down, I got this box, and my time in the archives had taught me that, archives are pretty dull, and it's usually thank you letters and, bus tickets. It's not often very exciting. Anyway, so I pick up a photo, and there is my aunt naked, lying back in the hay. D-Day's just happened. I don't know if she's just made love, who to, who's taken the photograph. There's no kind of clue, but it's a very exciting photograph. And then the next photograph is a man holding up an electric eel, it seems, and he's wearing brass goggles, and his exiguous kind of bathing costumes are very pronounced with what they contain. And you're thinking, who is this man? And it says September 1940, Saint-Maxime. I mean, this is 5 months after the Germans have invaded France. And then these love letters, absolutely fantastic love letters, but all clearly loving her, but all without a surname, all without an address. So they're called Emile or Danielle or Eugène, and then one called Otto, who sounded suspiciously German. And I transcribed them in a lather of excitement. And then I got a bit depressed because actually I couldn't work out what the story was. I didn't know who these people were. Without addresses or surnames, I didn't know what to do, and it clearly was that she was having quite a good time in occupied France. She didn't seem to be, as the New York Times headline said, no resistance. And I thought, should I write this as fiction? And I thought, no, she's kept all these documents for a purpose. These are the most vital documents of her life. She's carried them through occupied France and kept them. And I don't know what the story is. I can't write it as fiction because there's no narrative arc. And then I was in the Bodleian finishing an edition of Bruce Chatwin's letters, which had taken kind of 20 years to do. And I suddenly notice in this part of the Bodleian, which is quite difficult to get access to, you have to have a kind of reader's ticket for modern manuscripts, and I had it because of the Chatwin letters. I noticed a new catalogue had just been compiled called the Sutro Collection. Now, my aunt's best friend was a woman called Gillian Sutro, which is an unusual name. And they had grown up in Paris together before the war, and I used to remember Gillian when I went down to the farm at Wittering, the mushroom farm, a very glamorous person who'd known Graham Greene and slept with lots of famous people. And so I pulled out this catalogue, and it was indeed Gillian Sutro leaving her archive to the Bodleian. And then I see 3 boxes about my aunt. And so I order them up, and the first box has lots of photographs of them together before the war in Paris, on holiday after the war, Saint-Maxime. Second box, notebooks about Priscilla. And I open one of the notebooks, I read my name, and and the sentence, literally the hair stood up on the back of my neck. The sentence said, "Ever since I read what her journalist nephew, Nicholas Shakespeare, wrote in the Telegraph magazine in 1992, I have been determined to tell the truth about Priscilla's life." Had she kept secret about her war experience, I would not have said anything, but I cannot bear to see these lies. And all I'd written was a 2-line thing in an interview with a woman who'd lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, who'd written her memoirs, and I'd gone to interview this woman, and I'd written that my aunt had also been in a concentration camp and been tortured by the Germans, which is all that the family had inherited. And Gillian Sutro kind of knew this was a lie, had now decided to write out. So notebook after notebook is contained the details of my aunt's life, the surnames of these men, who they are, including Otto, who was the head of the Abwehr, the German intelligence service in Paris. And I'm just like, wow! And I remember going home that night and ringing my mother, and I said, "Are you sitting down? Because I've just discovered your sister. You know, her penultimate lover in occupied Paris was the head of German intelligence." My mother said, "I'm not surprised. I mean, if you had to survive in the war, you had to survive, and you would have been a collaborator if you'd wanted to live." And I thought that was a fantastic piece of wisdom and not being shocked by whatever people had to do to get by in the war. And so suddenly I had a story not about a brave woman, not about a traitress, but about an ordinary woman, like probably 98% of people in occupied France, who had to get by through using her body to survive. Terrible deprivation she had when she was in the camp. It was a camp for English women. So 4,000 English women are rounded up on one night in December 1940 and put in this military fortress in Besançon. 600 die of exposure in the next few months. I mean, terrible conditions, and no one knows about it. In France, they don't know about this. The Germans don't know about this. And so suddenly I'm finding stories that have not really been told. And especially a story of an ordinary woman in occupied France who has a fuckathon with Germans and with, French Nazis. But actually, they all fall in love with her. And she survives. And then she has to spend, after the war, she has to spend the next 40 years in silence because she can't admit to what happened. I mean, if it had been known, the terrible revelation is that her stepchildren told me that if their father had known that she'd had an affair with a German, he'd have chucked her out that day. Yeah. So she was trying to write the story of her life while knowing that if it was published, her life would be destroyed. And anyway, it was rejected by every publisher because at the bottom of the box were all these rejection slips. So a very, very sad life.
Very sad. It was the most beautiful book. I mean, it's non-fiction, but it reads like a novel. And it strikes me as you're talking, Nicholas, it just... thank you for sharing these beautiful stories, but it reminds me of something that Richard Walley said opening the festival last night. He said, "You're here to do something that we, Noongar people, Whadjuk tribe, have been doing for thousands of years, that's sharing stories." And he said, if you don't share stories, cultures die. So just maybe we finish on that note. Tell us what you think, Nicholas.
Well, I think I'm fascinated by why these great cultures like Germany and France have not produced any great novels since the war. And it's, the plotless meandering of the French novel or the German novel. And it seemed to me, as I researched Priscilla more, that they can't tell the story of occupied France. They can't tell the story. The Germans... When I was researching Snowleg, it seemed that grandparents couldn't talk to their children about what their experiences of the First World War had been, nor could the children talk to their children about their experiences of the Second World War. They all drank in different pubs, the three generations. And so I grew up, as I said, in Latin America, where storytelling is like a baton in a relay race. If you're a Marquesian, a fan of Garcia Marquez as I am, you're aware that he grows up in this house in Cartagena and his father is having an affair with the maid and probably children with the maid, the aunt's having an affair with the gardener. Everybody knows what's going on, and it's passed on to be passed on. And you can only really have a clean narrative if you face up to what your previous narrative has been. Otherwise, as I say, you're indulging in plotless meandering, not talking about the elephant in the room. And I felt that with Priscilla, it was wonderful, my mother's reaction, because actually no story is so toxic that it should be put under the carpet. The smell is terrible if you put it under the carpet and don't tell it. There's a famous, sorry, it will come to mind that there's a man called Montague Guest once at a house party was caught short and had to relieve himself. He couldn't go to the loo. He couldn't find, and so he relieved himself in one of the urns on the staircase. And he left, and about 4 days later, the hostess wrote to him and said, "We know it was you, but where?" And in a sense, kind of cheap way, storytelling is you should kind of reveal everything because it's not going to be so toxic. It's not going to leave such a smell if you conceal it.
Well, that seems a wonderful note to open the floor to questions. Did you everybody hear that question? That he's very interested in Nicholas's interested in Bruce Chatwin. Can we have Mike for the next one, please?
He was one of the most wonderful people I ever met. I went to, in about 1981, I went down to Patagonia to research a documentary about the British in Argentina, and the only book I could find was in Patagonia. I'd never heard of it, and I remember sitting by a bus stop in Commodore Rivadavia and beginning it and thinking, this person is speaking. I mean, like we have all of you with your favorite books, that you're being spoken to uniquely. Only you understand this person. I mean, unfortunately, I share this with about 15 million people. I felt that with Marquez's novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. And you feel it with all great books, that the writer's talking only to you. And I felt that within Patagonia. I thought it was the most extraordinary book. And when I got back to London, I sought him out. I was about 24 years old, and I went to see him in his tiny flat. And I had been in Argentina as an adolescent. I worked as a cowhand, and I had I used to wear a poncho, a red poncho with black trims, as all the gauchos did. And I'd recently discovered that this poncho, which was known to be the colors of a great hero of the resistance, Güemes. We knew the poncho as black for the death of Güemes and red for the blood of his soldiers. That's how the kind of colors were. And Chatwin was working on a theory about the color red then. And I said, well, I've just discovered that Güemes is what's peculiar. It's a Hispanicization of the Scots Weems. And Weems went out to Argentina and became a kind of freedom fighter and gave his, but more than that, he gave his colors of the Weems kilt, which are black and red, to this poncho. So Chatwin got into complete excitement because he had been working on the theory about the color red, where Garibaldi, who was fighting in the War of Resistance in Uruguay at the time, had taken a consignment of these ponchos from a warehouse in Montevideo, and on coming back to Italy, had tailored the ponchos into uniforms for his red shirts, who would then kind of fight the Risorgimento in Italy. And then this would be the flag that flew above the Dresden barricades in 1848, and that now flies above the Kremlin. And so within 4 minutes of meeting Bruce Chatwin, we had established, to our deep satisfaction, a direct link between the red flag of socialism and a Scots kilt. And I tell that story because the point is, all his stories were like that. He would bring something out of whoever he met and link it with something he was working on and make you feel yourself as if you were contributing to his much better story.
How lovely. There's another one there behind.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, and welcome to Perth. I just wonder why you chose fiction rather than non-fiction for Oddfellows, because as a fictional book, it would have worked just as well, do you think?
Okay. I'm going to read. Years ago, I read this description by an American philosopher called Richard Rorty about fiction, and it stuck with me. I read it earlier this morning, but forgive me if some of you heard it. And Rorty says that one way fiction differs from history is that enables the reader to experience pain. And that he writes, cruelty is the worst thing we can do. By imagining another's suffering, it becomes harder to inflict pain ourselves. Fiction, by dramatizing the particular, the idiosyncratic, and the personal, invites our empathy and therefore holds out the promise of making us less cruel. Now, if I had just told the story of Oddfellows as a history, I wouldn't have been able to get inside the characters. I wouldn't have been able to dramatize I wouldn't have been able to tell you why these two camel men had behaved as they did. I would have just had the naked facts, which were already polluted by the reports in the newspapers. I mean, if you read The Barrier Mine and The Barrier Truth, every survivor tells a story that is different from another survivor. And then when they retell the story, it's different from the story they told before. And so you realize you're dealing already in storytelling. And so, in a sense, you have to be a storyteller for these survivors. And I wanted to get inside the heads of these two camel men. I wanted to understand what had driven them. And the historical narrative was not going to tell me that. I had to use the novelist's arsenal to create an empathy. And with Priscilla Cowie, I had to make her 22, not 17, but it didn't work. So I had to I wanted to be free to change some of the historical facts I'd found. So fiction allowed me the freedom to do that.
Another question just there.
Thank you. On Oddfellows again, I'm just wondering if you pushed on with the Broken Hill reaction to the shooting, in other words, going against the German club and the burning of that down, and the creating of stopping the fire engines going to the German club, and just this backlash that was against the attack, where the two men then struggled to a hill and are finally killed, and the fact that nobody would bury them, so they brought in an Aboriginal to do it. So that's why nobody knows where they're buried. So,
well, that's one story. We don't know if that's true or not.
That's right.
I mean, I wanted to make it longer than it was. I mean, publishers are very keen. They don't like novellas. They want it to be novels. And I desperately tried to make it longer. And the material I couldn't stretch it. I could have obviously talked a lot about the crowd burning down the German club, but actually I really wanted to just concentrate on the woman who was shot by the man who had started to open her horizons. And he'd accidentally shot the one woman who was nice to him in Broken Hill. I wanted to concentrate on that deliberately. I mean, yes, anybody might have written it a different way. And actually, when I'd finished it, and I was doing some radio interviews from England to Broken Hill, again, none of these radio interviewers had heard the story. Even from Broken Hill, they hadn't heard the story. And then I got an email from a woman who said, I wrote a novel about this 2 years ago, and I was in correspondence with her. I said, my goodness, I'm so pleased I didn't know you'd written a novel. And what was gripping is that we both had settled on the same dynamic of this girl who'd been shot with I mean, it's a fairly obvious thing, but you're trying to kind of cross two cultures, and so we both used her as the bridge. I long to read her novel now I finish mine. But again, 2 days ago I found that there was another novel written about 4 years ago by a woman called Jessica Gregson called An Ice Cream Army, and I look forward to seeing what she did with the material. I think you're going to, a novelist will find different ways of mining the same material, but that's what's so exciting. I mean, I hope there are many more novels on the Broken Hill massacre.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Nicholas, I'm Clarence O'Brien's grandson, so I have some knowledge of the subject.
Yes.
Okay? But growing up...
So Clarence O'Brien is the boyfriend of Alma Cowie, or we think.
Yeah.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
One of the sort of social dimensions that I don't think you pushed quite hard enough in the book.
I'm sure it's wriggling with inaccuracies.
Okay. It's very, very hard to believe how ultra-Anglo Broken Hill was. I grew up there in the 50s and the 60s, and we didn't tolerate anybody. Afghans, Yugoslavs, Italians. You know, we were just unbelievably ultra-Anglo. I don't know whether that represented the rest of Australia at the time, but it certainly represented our town, of course. You had to be born in Broken Hill to work in Broken Hill. You had to have
But how did you... I mean, I'm fascinated to know what was the oral history of Clarence O'Brien and Al Macaulay. I mean, what extra details did you know?
Well, my mother's still alive, okay, so I talked to my mother last night just to do a bit of brushing up. She said, look, she does not know whether he went to get permission from Alistair Cowie's father the night before to get married, but there was a ring involved. He had purchased a ring, but it was not a diamond ring because he couldn't afford one. It was an amethyst or something like that.
You see, I never knew any of this. I didn't even know they were boyfriend and girlfriend. It was kind of... One of the newspaper reports said they were quite close. So I leapt.
My mother says they were close, but whether he intended to propose that day is not known. But let's flick back to the attitude of the town. You sort of, in the novel, you started to, by mentioning all the mutual benefit societies and all that sort of business, you gave some aspect to the character of the town. But as I said, I grew up there in the 50s and the 60s, and you could not believe how ultra-Anglo it was. So anybody could have been provoked to shooting people on a picnic train, whether it be Afghans or whatever. The other, coincidentally, in the 90s, I was in Quetta in Baluchistan and having lunch with the chief minister and under a setting which was pretty hard to have a casual conversation. And he said to me, he said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Broken Hill in Australia. And he said, okay. He said, I just came back from Broken Hill. And so the reason he was there is because Pazminko was investing in a mine in Baluchistan. But he said those Afghans were from Quetta. He said he'd looked at some documents that were given to him by the library, and he said he recognised the family names as connecting with family names in the Quetta area of Baluchistan. But anyhow, my main comment is very hard to believe how prejudiced we were.
Thank you.
Oh, fascinating.
Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming. And I'd like to remind you that Nicholas will now be going to the Festival Bookshop in the Undercroft to sign copies of his books for you. So don't miss out there. And please join me in thanking Nicholas.
Thank you for your input.